I'm going to tell you about the verdict that changed my life, the last one I issued, and the first one that left me completely alone. I'm Clarissa Williams, a judge in Atlanta, and that high-profile case had me backed into a corner like never before. I signed the ruling that shattered careers, destroyed families, and, in the end, broke my own bonds beyond the courtroom. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It all started with an explosive case that captured the attention of the entire city. A businessman, accused of corruption and fraud, requested that I be the one to handle the matter. The pressure was unbearable. The media wouldn't stop. People voiced opinions without knowing the facts, and above it all, I had to make a fair decision based on the law, not public opinion. But what would you do when upholding justice meant blowing up the lives of people you knew? The defendant, a man with power and connections, was also a family man. His wife, children, friends were keeping track of every move. And on the other side, victims waiting for an answer that would give them some hope back. In the middle of it all, there I was, at a desk that seemed to weigh tons, holding a file and the future out there resting on my decisions. What I didn't know is how quickly that verdict would splash into my own life. I signed it with conviction intact, but neither the law nor the strength of my authority could protect me from the emotional and social maze that came afterward. In little time, relationships I thought were unbreakable crumbled. Friendships I believed would last forever turned cold. Some colleagues, in private, questioned my judgment. And worse, loneliness embraced me like never before. But this story doesn't end there. The ruling, once executed, was everywhere. People in favor, people against. Protests. Social media campaigns. And I, in the middle of it all, trying to stay strong while feeling the shadow of that decision grow over my personal and professional life. What I will reveal today isn't just the judicial outcome, but everything that came after, what no one sees when it comes to a high-profile verdict. The repercussions didn't end with the verdict, nor with the last signature of my pen. On the contrary, that was where a much bigger battle began, a silent battle within me. If you thought a judge's lives shielded behind the robe, you were wrong. I discovered that authority has a price, and that price was losing who I thought I was. But what did I do when it was all over? How did I face that emptiness? That, my friends, is the part that will leave you wondering if justice, in the end, is always justice, or if we are just pieces in a game that no one wins. I invite you to stay until the end, because my story goes beyond the trial itself. I'm going to tell you how that last verdict not only defined a case, but marked the end of my career and the beginning of a loneliness I never imagined. Want to know what happened? Then follow me, because here begins the story of the verdict that changed my life forever. Signing that judgment was one of the most decisive and distressing moments of my life. I remember that from the moment the file arrived on my desk, I knew it wouldn't be an ordinary case. Not only because it involved people with public and powerful profiles, but also because the magnitude of the accusations was so profound that any ruling I made would resonate far beyond the courtroom. The press, the lawyers, the families all expected a firm verdict, but also a fair one. And those two words don't always go hand in hand, not even for a judge with years of experience. As the hearings progressed, the pressure grew like an unstoppable snowball. Everyone wanted the case to serve as an example, to be a social and judicial turning point. I couldn't afford mistakes. I remember sleepless nights, going over every testimony, every piece of evidence, trying to anticipate every consequence. The courtroom, the same one that had seen me issue hundreds of sentences over the years, became a minefield where every word I uttered could unleash a storm. I felt I carried not only the objective responsibility of dispensing justice, but also the invisible weight of all the expectations and fears of an entire city. The moment to deliver the verdict came with paralyzing solemnity. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice had to be firm, to show that although human, I could not falter. I read the verdict clearly, knowing I was determining the fate of lives that would never be the same again. When I finished, there was a silence that seemed eternal, as if the entire court was holding its breath. Upon leaving, the press awaited me, capturing every gesture, trying to find any sign of doubt or regret. Inside, I was shattered into 1,000 pieces, but I couldn't show it. The following days were a whirlwind. The execution of the ruling was quick and rigorous. There was no room for doubt or delay. But what no one seemed to foresee was how the people closest to those involved, and myself, of course, would react. Disagreements, reproaches, veiled threats began. What had been a strictly judicial case turned into a social, media, and personal battle that slowly eroded me. Friendships I believed unbreakable began to distance themselves because they couldn't share the burden I carried nor fully understand me. My relationship with some colleagues also became tense. Some judged my decisions, others feared being exposed in the controversy. In those moments, I realized that the true loneliness of a judge is not being in the courtroom, but when returning home to an empty house, a silence heavier than any verdict. I tried to find refuge in my family, but the hours I dedicated to the case and the social stigma eroded even those bonds. In the end, there was only that coffee table where I mentally reviewed over and over whether I had done the right thing. The most painful thing was not the public accusations, which also hurt, nor the professional wear and tear, which I expected. It was the constant feeling of having betrayed a part of myself, my principles, my values, to fulfill a duty that I could no longer carry without intolerable collateral damage. With every letter of complaint, with every evasive look, I felt how my judicial authority faded in favor of growing isolation. That last sentence had condemned me to a loneliness I had never foreseen in any courtroom. As I approached the end of my career, I began to understand something I had never wanted to admit before. Justice is not a perfect instrument, but a human act full of imperfections and contradictions. I can issue sentences, but I cannot control how those decisions become a burden for those around me or for myself. It was a bitter lesson, a reality that accompanied me the moment I signed my resignation. The morning I handed in the letter of resignation, I felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. Finally, I could escape the public eye, the whirlwind, and the tensions that consumed me, but I knew the peace I sought came at a price, the lack of purpose and deep loneliness. My colleagues said goodbye to me with respect, but also with the distance that circumstances and fear of what that last sentence represented impose. No one wanted to get too close. No one dared to ask about the personal impact it had had on me. Since then, I live in that uncomfortable stillness, trying to make sense of what my career was and the risk I took, paying with more than just resignation. When sometimes I mentally relive every detail, the question that torments me is whether a sentence can ever be truly final. Because despite having closed the professional chapter, another silent one opens, where the judgment is internal, constant, and often unavoidable. Now, far from the robe and the bench, I think about what that last sentence taught me about human fragility behind power. I was given great responsibilities, but also left with the immense burden of knowing that justice, no matter how rigorous, does not always heal, nor protect, nor unite. Sometimes it simply divides and leaves open wounds that only time may, perhaps, begin to heal. And although I lived it firsthand, that experience makes me want to share this story because I believe that all of us, in any role, face decisions that change lives, including our own. And in those moments, it is not only external strength that sustains us, but the courage to face the consequences, the loneliness, and the doubts that come afterward. My last sentence was also my deepest lesson. There is no authority that saves you from the real impact of what you do when you are human. It is an uncomfortable truth, but real, and maybe that is the reflection I want to leave with you today, without judgments or absolute certainties, only with the honesty of someone who has learned to live with the weight of their own decisions. Because maybe, in the end, true justice is not on paper or in the written ruling, but in the way we face the truth we must bear when everything ends. Weeks passed, and what had seemed like a passing storm turned into a hurricane capable of sweeping away everything in its path. The reactions were not limited to the public or media spheres. Somehow, the domino effect of that sentence began to twist the lives of all involved, including my own. I discovered, beyond what I had anticipated, that justice has a personal cost that cannot be measured with simple numbers or statistics. It was a price I paid in silence, trapped in a labyrinth of contradictory emotions, where responsibility mixed with guilt and pressure with emptiness. Every morning, upon opening my eyes, I felt the weight of what I had done. It was not only the awareness of having changed the fate of other people, but the certainty that, in doing so, I had opened a crack within myself that nothing seemed to close. There were days when I wondered if the sentence had reprimanded only those involved or if it had also sentenced me to merciless isolation. Loneliness was certainly not new in my profession, but I had never felt it so dense, so tangible. Now, that loneliness lodged itself even in everyday corners, during morning coffee, in the echo of the empty office, in the absence of those conversations that once filled my days with life. The most painful part was how, little by little, the people who had supported me in difficult moments began to drift away. Some feared their words might be misunderstood, others avoided contact to not be splattered by the controversy. Even a couple of old friends, whom I considered unconditional, responded to me with coldness or indifference. At times, I felt they looked at me as if I were responsible for a collective tragedy, as if the sentence bore the indelible mark of a judgment not only anecdotal but morally questionable. It was no longer enough to respect my role. Now, it seemed I had to bear the weight of an unpopular ruling and a social dispute that no one had asked to personalize. The outside world became a cold stage where justice and empathy seemed to walk opposite paths. In the streets and cafes, the furtive glances once cast toward me with respect or admiration turned into uncomfortable silences or whispered comments. I felt, as never before, that my public figure had been banished to an invisible corner from which I could not escape. The press, always eager for a controversial reaction, closely followed my every step, and although harassing me was not their explicit job, the pressure of knowing I could be misinterpreted at any moment made me withdraw even further into myself. There were moments when I surprised myself wishing, with deep sadness, that everything had been different. That I could have found a third way between relentless justice and necessary compassion, that my decision had not been a definitive sentence for many, including myself. But reality, harsh and cruel, reminded me that justice is not a perfect act nor a path without wounds. The sentence had closed an official chapter, yes, but it had also opened invisible wounds that would take time to heal, if they ever did. Sometimes, in the midst of those sleepless nights, I reviewed every word of the text I read on the day I sentenced. I recalled the tone with which I pronounced each phrase, the weight I placed on every comma, the pause I made before delivering the final sentence. I asked myself over and over if I had chosen the right words, if I had been human enough to understand the complexity I was judging. Each mental review was a cloud that darkened more the professional certainty with which I had enforced the law. I did not know whether it was the external or internal pressure that consumed me more, but I did know that for every affected person, I had created a before and after that no written sentence could completely remedy. And amid that emotional turmoil, an unexpected twist appeared when I learned that an appeal before higher courts was beginning to take shape. Appeals were nothing new, but this time I felt that process revived wounds, extending the echo of that sentence beyond what I had thought. The lawyers of one of the involved parties were not resigned and planned to reopen public debate, seeking not only to overturn the decision, but to cleanse a tarnished public image. That reopened the controversy and forced me to confront, in my withdrawal, the possibility that the sentence would never be the closure I had expected. If justice could be revisited by a third party, so too could the personal impact prolong itself, infecting my long nights with new uncertainties. With that new judicial chapter occupying my mind, I knew I could no longer ignore the signs of where that warned me the pressure was consuming me from within. Anxiety showed up like a silent visitor, and moments of sadness gave way to episodes of chronic insomnia. Images of the case, testimonies, the courtroom, returned in waves that trapped me mercilessly when I least expected it. I experienced a vulnerability I had never allowed myself to show in my profession. It was then that I understood that, although I exercised authority from a pulpit, I was as human and fragile as anyone under judgment. That revelation shook my concept of strength and reminded me of a simple but profound truth. We are much more than the decisions we make. We are also the consequences that mark us forever. In an act of desperation, I began seeking support from therapists and trusted groups, trying to find a refuge where I could explain the inexplicable with words I had until then only dared to whisper in the intimacy of my thoughts. I discovered that speaking was not as easy as it seemed for someone who had spent her life imposing order and control. Untying this emotional knot demanded courage, a courage different from that required to pass sentences, more intimate, more exposed. But little by little, I realized that process was also a form of personal justice, one that had to be earned with the same rigor but greater compassion. And as I progressed along that path, another unexpected event challenged my newly found vulnerability. Days after submitting my resignation, I received an anonymous letter. The words were laconic and cold, but their moral reach was relentless. They reproached me for having destroyed lives, not only public but private, and called me the invisible culprit of irreparable harm. They did not mention names, nor ask for mercy. They only accused, and in that absence of personal contacts lay one of the hardest blows: total uprooting. The feeling of being pointed at without even being able to defend myself before those who condemned me without trial or attention to the complexity of the case. That missive was like a dagger that finally opened the emotional wound I had been trying to close with words and silences. Paranoia settled in at specific moments. I avoided going to certain places, distrusted unexpected calls, and distanced myself even more from my environment. Anxiety was no longer only internal. It seemed to live and breathe with me in every awakening. No one demanded that I appear strong, but I kept playing that role because it was the entire identity I knew. Perhaps, for years, I had hidden behind the robe the fragility that the decision of that last sentence ended up unearthing. Thus, little by little, I attacked the invisible wall where I took refuge, aware that the only way to heal was to face the loneliness and doubts that social condemnation had imposed as chains. It was then that I understood. The true weight of a sentence was not the signature on the document nor the administrative ruling, but the deep and silent impact it left on those who issued it. That reality struck me as an unquestionable truth. Justice is imperfect, distant, often forceful, but behind every verdict there is a person who suffers as much or more than those judged. And the cruelest paradox is that, to maintain that function, sometimes that person must sacrifice herself in silence, without asking for help, becoming invisible so that the judicial machinery does not stop. But the machinery always leaves marks. Marks that hurt inside. In that context, I began to rethink not only the meaning of my last sentence, but also of a whole life dedicated to what defined my identity. The loneliness that accompanied it was not only external rejection, but an internal mourning, a mourning for a part of me that justice had exhausted, a part that longed to be heard without judgment, without speaking of precedents or laws. Thus, the transition from judge to ordinary woman was also a process of reconstruction where every fragment had to be gathered with tenderness and patience. The final judgment, it seemed, was not the one I had delivered in court, but the one I needed to pass on myself. And without knowing when or how, I began to write. First on loose sheets, clumsily, without order or sense. Then in notebooks that gradually filled with memory and emotions, with confessions that never dared to come out aloud in the courtroom. Writing became a different form of justice, an act of release, understanding, and, in a way, personal repair. Through words, I could put distance and presence at the same time, understanding that justice is not just a code, but the living and contradictory experience of those who impose it and those who receive it. In sharing this story, I do not seek excuses or justifications for what I did. I do not intend to be exempted from the weight of my decisions. I only want it to be understood that, behind every sentence, there is a person who cannot always bear alone the emotional burden that role demands. Justice is not simply a public act, it is also a private battle, made of doubts, loneliness, and deep desires to do what is right in a world that is rarely just. Perhaps, for those who hear this, my experience serves as a reminder that every decision, no matter how rational and rule-based, touches the most human fiber of those who make it. And that understanding, that invisible side, that shadow projected when the courtroom curtain falls, is perhaps the most necessary step to building, in the future, a justice a bit more human, more understanding, and less cruel. Not because we can avoid mistakes or consequences, but because true courage lies in facing what remains afterward, in admitting our own vulnerabilities, and in seeking, although it may sometimes seem impossible, a path toward internal reconciliation. My last sentence taught me that justice can break, but also that the human spirit, though unsteady, always seeks to mend. And although the loneliness that followed was harsh and profound, it made me discover a dimension of myself that the robe never could show. That is, perhaps, the most important lesson I carry with me and dare to share now. At the end of the trial, when the bench is empty and the courtroom silent, there remains only the person, with all her complexity and humanity, who must find her way to live with the indelible marks of her own decisions. As the months passed, the pressure did not ease. Its intensity, rather, increased like an unrelenting tide that swept everything in its path. There were moments when I would sit in front of my desk, trying to organize my thoughts, but the avalanche of memories, voices, and tensions seemed too overwhelming. The appeal filed by the lawyers not only called my ruling into question, but also reactivated the machinery of public judgment, reopening freshly healed wounds while making me feel exposed, vulnerable, and judged again. Not only in court, but in every corner of my daily life. The combination of helplessness and constant scrutiny kept me in a state of permanent alert. The days blurred together, and the nights became a territory of loneliness darker than ever. The image I had built over decades seemed to fade under the unbearable weight of this final sentence. Colleagues who once exchanged looks of complicity and respect began to avoid me, not out of direct hostility, but due to the discomfort of associating with someone singled out by public opinion. In court, the distance was not only physical, it was emotional, and I felt my name circulating in whispers laden with judgment and resentment. That atmosphere also invaded the most intimate spaces. Family, despite their unconditional love, could not fully penetrate the shroud of silence that enveloped me. I became an enigma to those around me, someone trapped in an invisible prison of isolation, and the words I once used to express complex reasoning became thick and clumsy in everyday conversations. Still, the appeal process continued, running parallel to an internal process of breakdown and personal reinvention. I received, with a mix of resignation and surprise, letters from people who had been directly or indirectly affected by that ruling, some filled with reproach, others with gratitude. These letters, sometimes anonymous, became reflections of the human complexity behind the case: bitterness, pain, remorse, even hope. Justice, I understood then more than ever, cannot be a perfectly balanced scale, because behind every weight there is always a story that defies logic and oblivion. Those writings reached me like scattered fragments of a mirror broken into 1,000 pieces, and with each word, I felt my constructed self fragmenting as well, only to be reshaped in unexpected ways. But the hardest blow came unexpectedly. One day, while walking down a quiet street, I felt a cold gaze upon me. I couldn't immediately identify whose it was, but the effect was immediate, a paralyzing shiver that reminded me my presence still sparked controversy and rejection. Later, I was contacted by a journalist with a different approach than usual. He seemed less interested in sensationalism and more in understanding the person behind the verdict, the woman who had carried the burden of a decision that shaped lives. In that interview, a slow, careful, human, I was able to speak openly, without the mask of authority that had protected me until then. It was both a liberating and painful encounter, which helped blur, in part, the impersonal image created by media noise. That public dialogue, different from the fast and relentless judgments, had an unexpected effect. Some voices began to change their tone. There were those who, without ceasing to question the decision, started to recognize the complexity of the problem, the inherent contradiction in any attempt to administer justice in a world that refuses to be just. It was not a total reconciliation by any means, but it was a first step toward humanizing a case that seemed destined to remain trapped in the rigidity of law and social controversy. Amid this tense calm, the anonymous letter I had received became a turning point for me. I decided not to ignore it or hide it at the bottom of the drawer where I kept what I wished to forget. I read it over and over, trying to understand that faceless reproach, that accusation that seemed to come from a dark, cold, and impersonal place. Then I realized that, beyond the content, what hurt me was that void of dialogue, that absence of opportunity to explain my humanity behind the robe. Justice, in its traditional form, left no room to show that fragility, to make visible the doubts and pain that accompanied every sentence I handed down. So, I decided to take a brave step and turn that letter into an opportunity to confront my own ghosts. I began writing a response that would not be sent to any formal destination, but would serve to find balance between the guilt I carried and the understanding I needed of myself. In that text, I opened the doors to the vulnerability I had been hiding for years. I confessed my fears, my exhaustion, my endless sleepless nights. I spoke of the loneliness that had become a constant companion, and of the cruel paradox of being a judge who, suddenly, was sentenced by everyone in the silence of her own soul. Writing that letter was, ultimately, an act of self-love, one more step on the tortuous path toward reconciliation with the woman trapped between the robe and her heart. Slowly, from that moment on, the rhythm of my days began to change. I started to accept that I couldn't control everything, that human justice is imperfect, and that above all, I had to allow myself to be human too. On that journey, I met people going through their own invisible battles, and in their stories, I found unexpected affinities, a silent network of those who, like me, bore the weight of difficult decisions and their consequences. With them, I shared words, silences, and tears. I learned that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but complementary, and that one cannot survive without the other. Loneliness was still there, but it was no longer an absolute prison or a deadly silence. It became a space where I could listen to myself, understand myself, and rebuild myself. The justice I administered in court had ended, but a new form of justice was emerging, one that allowed me to judge less, forgive more, and live with the uncertainty that always accompanies difficult decisions. It was not an easy or linear path, and every step required patience, courage, and self-compassion. However, it was the path I chose not to let that final sentence, so relentless in its scope, define who I was forever. Today, when I speak of it, I do not do so to justify what I did, nor to deny the pain caused. I do it to remember and to make others remember that behind every ruling, every decision, there are people with complex emotions, with invisible stories that deserve to be told. Because in that narrative lies hope, in recognizing the humanity that unites us, in opening spaces for empathy and understanding, and in accepting that the search for justice is also a personal quest where we not only judge others, but ourselves as well. Perhaps this story has no happy endings or clear answers. And maybe it never will. But if there is one thing I have learned on this journey, it is that true courage does not lie solely in making hard decisions or maintaining authority, but in allowing ourselves to fall and rise, in bearing our souls without fear, and in finding, amidst the cracks and scars, the strength to move forward. Because the most important justice is not the one recorded on a document, but the one we find for ourselves in the deepest silence, where truth and humanity intertwine without masks or judgment. And so, at the end of this long journey, I realized that my last ruling was only the beginning of a much more intense and complex process, the trial of my own humanity, the understanding that every verdict has a cost, not only for those who receive it, but for those who deliver it. And perhaps, if I can share anything with those who hear this story, it is that behind every judicial decision, no matter how harsh, there is a beating heart, a doubting mind, a soul seeking its own justice, its own peace. Justice, like life, is imperfect, but in that imperfection lies the possibility to grow, learn, and ultimately heal. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson I carry in this open book that has been my life. A lesson that, despite everything, gives me hope to believe in tomorrows where humanity and justice can finally walk together, not as opposites, but as inseparable parts of the same path. However, just when it seemed that I was beginning to find some balance, life put an unexpected test before me again, one that confronted me with everything I had been avoiding until then. The appeal of the verdict was moving slowly forward, but its social and personal repercussions seemed to extend indefinitely, like a persistent echo that refuses to fade. It was not only the sentence I had delivered that continued to generate reactions, but the symbol it had come to represent, the human cost of the judicial system, the fragility behind the appearance of invulnerability, and the shadow of doubt that always accompanies those who decide over the lives of others. I remember that morning when I received a notice that changed the course of my isolation. A formal invitation to participate in a forum for discussion about judicial reform, a space where former judges, lawyers, activists, and academics gathered to talk not only about laws, but about ethics, mistakes, and learning. At first, I felt an almost visceral rejection. Why face that world again, the one that had placed me at the center of the storm? But something inside me recognized that perhaps it was the necessary next step, a way to open conversation, to legitimize my experience as part of a change that needed to come. When I entered that room, I immediately felt the weight of all the gazes. Not only were there those who shared my years of struggle for justice, but also many young people, some with inquisitive eyes, others with a passion I had lost long ago. The words I heard at that meeting surprised me deeply. Confessions of errors, accounts of insecurities, heated debates about arbitrariness and the humanity involved in every ruling. It was not a place for the relentless judgment I had known, but for shared reflection, to build bridges where before there had only been walls. In that atmosphere, armed only with the voice I had left after so many years, I shared my story, recounting again the internal process from the first doubt to the final verdict, passing through loneliness and the transformation that the consequences of my decisions had brought. It was not easy. I felt I was exposing not only Clarissa Williams, the judge, but Clarissa, the person, the being with hidden wounds. But I also felt an unexpected relief. For the first time in a long time, someone was listening not only to the verdict, but to the soul behind it. The most revealing moment came when one of the participants, a young lawyer with an intense glow in his eyes, took the floor to thank me for that courage. He said something that stayed imprinted in my mind. In the law, we see rules and precedents, but we often forget that those who apply them are human. There is no justice without humanity, nor humanity without error. I thank you for reminding us of that. His words echoed like a balm, small but deep, able to cross the cracks I had built around myself. From that day on, I began to take more initiatives that at first seemed unthinkable. I started collaborating in workshops for young lawyers, not as an unknown and almost untouchable figure, but as someone willing to share the shadows and lights of her career. That internal transformation also led me to reactivate broken ties, to seek the faces behind those voices I had received in my letters, to understand that the judge and the community were not separated by an insurmountable barrier, but united in a complex network of affections, conflicts, and reconciliations. It was then that an unexpected turn emerged in this story that could have seemingly remained stuck under the weight of the last sentence. A boy named Eli appeared in my life. He was not someone I knew directly from the case, but the teenage son of a friend of mine who was going through a huge battle with juvenile justice. Eli had been detained for a serious offense, and his situation painfully reminded me that the decisions I had made for years touched not only the high spheres of the law, but also the most vulnerable edges of our society. In that encounter, I felt that the distance I had installed in myself began to crack with an unexpected force. I spent hours with Eli, listening to his story, a mixture of confusion, talent, resentment, and fear. In his eyes, I saw the same uncertainty I had kept for decades, the blend of guilt and hope, the struggle to find a path in a system that so often seemed unjust and impersonal. I did not intervene in his case with authority, but with humanity. I offered him support, conversation, and understanding, and in that unexpected encounter, I found a reflection of the judge who, years ago, had dreamed of a world where justice did not destroy but healed. However, these steps toward the light were neither linear nor free of difficulties. Sometimes I felt like I was walking on an invisible bridge, about to fall to one side or the other. The internal tension I had carried for years reappeared in moments of doubt and fatigue. Some mornings I woke with the heavy sensation that I would never fully detach myself from what had happened, that this weight would define me forever. There were nights when loneliness gripped me more strongly, and the internal voices of regret and self-assessment scorched my mind. It was in those moments that writing once again became my refuge, my way of dialoguing with myself without fear or judgment. The words flowed, sometimes painful, sometimes revealing, like a river that carries sediments to leave a cleaner channel. Among those invisible pages, I wove ideas for a possible book, perhaps a testimony or a manual for others who may cross the valley of judicial uncertainty. In my silence, I hid a question I did not dare to ask aloud. Is it possible that despite everything, the last sentence delivered was not the end, but just another chapter of a story still under construction? And if so, how could I build that narrative without fear and social judgment paralyzing my voice again? Gradually, the answers came in the most unexpected ways, in the music softly playing one afternoon in the park, in the sincere smile of a stranger, in the closeness of friends who without words understood my process. I realized I was not alone, that I had never truly been alone, but had insisted on feeling imprisoned in the cell of my own fears. Then I remembered the brightest moments of practicing my profession, those in which justice meant empathy, listening, and decision-making with awareness, moments that restored my faith in the human capacity to heal, even when all seemed lost. And it is that memory, that warm recollection amid the coldness of judgment and the harshness of the ruling, that sustains me today. Because looking back, I know that sentence, the hardest of my career, was not a definitive condemnation, but a trigger for the deep reconstruction of what it means to be a judge and a human being. Accepting that weight, inhabiting that contradiction, was what allowed me to emerge from darkness and rediscover justice from a more authentic, freer place. But there remains one lesson I do not dare forget: the power that a judicial decision holds to transform lives, and the price those who issue them sometimes pay in their own flesh. That price, invisible to many, is the true judgment we face as human beings. And although the sentence remains in history, that other justice, the one born in the silence of the soul, is what really defines who we are. As I conclude this chapter of my life, I do not feel I have resolved all the questions nor healed all the wounds. But I do carry with me the certainty that the humanity behind the robe, with all its doubts and strengths, is the key to approaching a justice that, far from being an unattainable ideal, is a daily act of understanding, respect, and love. That justice that, finally, manages to tear down walls and build bridges, not only between those who judge and those judged, but between each of us as individuals in constant search. I do not know what the future holds for me, nor if I will ever take a place again in a courtroom. Perhaps I will not, and perhaps that does not matter. Because I have learned that the true sentence is not in books nor in verdicts, but in the way we choose to face the impact of our decisions, in how we transform pain into possibility, loneliness into space for reunion, and justice into a path towards shared humanity. And if that is the last lesson I can leave behind, I will feel at peace knowing that, in the end, having delivered that sentence was only the beginning of a long but valuable judgment, that of my own soul in search of redemption and truth. As the months passed, the appeal of the verdict was one of those slow processes that seem to drag life in slow motion. But while formal justice moved at its own pace, the personal universe around me stirred with an intensity one hadn't expected. Social pressure did not cease, and although I had chosen public silence, conversations behind my back continued, often filled with judgments and half-formed speculations. One day, someone described my case as a monument to judicial tragedy, and although it hurt, at that moment I knew I could no longer hide in denial. The time had come to face not only the external consequences, but the internal ones, the true crisis that had settled in my soul. The invitation to the Judicial Reform Forum arrived in the midst of this whirlwind. At first, the idea of returning to that heavily charged environment, so typical of a time I believed was already closed, made me tremble. I had to take a deep breath more than once before responding affirmatively. But I knew they needed me there, even if perhaps mostly for myself. Crossing that door was like stepping into a minefield of emotions and memories, a setting that seemed designed to revive wounds I would have preferred to let heal in silence. Upon entering, I felt the weight of those gazes that not only scrutinized my decisions, but also me as a person. What I saw was unexpected: different faces, mixed ages, divergent stories. It was not the traditional courtroom where cold debates took place, but a space for listening and openness. Someone said something in those first minutes that caught me: we are not infallible, nor should we pretend to be. Mistakes are part of our humanity and also of our learning. Those words echoed inside me like a liberating echo. It was in that environment that I decided to open up, without masks or protocols. I told the process that led me to issue that sentence, but also the doubts that consumed me before and after, the sleepless nights, the feeling of having made solitary decisions that irreversibly impacted lives. I shared the weight of the loneliness that accompanied each step. I could see some nodding, others moved. We were not adversaries there, but accomplices in the search for something better. Then an unexpected turn occurred. A young lawyer, whose gaze seemed to pierce the room, stood up to speak. His trembling voice carried the strength of truth and reflection. "Thank you," he said, "for showing us that behind the robe there is a person, someone who faces mistakes, who carries doubt. Sometimes we are afraid to admit we have failed, but this teaches us that justice is also humanity. Thank you for reminding us that we are not machines and that every decision has a face." Those words gave way to an open, profound dialogue, without pretensions. We talked about ethics, the need to reform not just laws but also attitudes. It was a conversation that left me both exhausted and hopeful. For the first time in a long time, I felt I was not alone on this path of learning and reconstruction. Leaving there, something changed in me. I began looking for ways to get involved again, not from a distance but from closeness. I participated in workshops with young lawyers, silently sharing stories of triumph and failure, lessons that only painful experience can offer. I was not the infallible judge, but the person who has faced human and legal complexity, who has made mistakes and tried to learn from them. Meanwhile, my relationships, those fractured after that case, began to show signs of repair. It was as if by opening up myself, others could approach and build bridges that seemed broken forever. I received letters, messages, calls, some belated, others unexpected, always full of stories about how that sentence had affected us all. I read them carefully, without fear, understanding that the people behind those words deserved to be heard. But nothing prepared me for what came next when Eli appeared. He was not part of the media case, nor someone from my closest circle. He was the son of a friend who was fighting his own battle within the juvenile justice system. Receiving the news of his detention shook me more deeply than I expected. I had spent years observing the system from the bench of authority, with the distance the robe provides, but now I found myself face to face with a much more intimate and raw reality. The first thing I did was sit down with Eli, not as a judge, but as someone willing to listen without prejudice. We talked for hours, and in his story, I saw a disturbing mixture of fear, anger, confusion, and also flashes of hope. He told me about his mistakes, the circumstances that led him there, but also about his desire to change, the search for light amid darkness. That conversation became a ritual for me, a perpetual reminder of why justice must also be compassionate, beyond the cold letter of the law. From those encounters, my vision of justice began to change even more. I understood that cases are not just files or precedents in a book, but living lives that beat and transform, lives that have the power to heal or destroy in ways that transcend the sentence itself. The experience with Eli taught me that human accompaniment can become a bridge to redemption, a seed for hope when everything seems lost. Nevertheless, the path of internal repair was not easy. The wounds I thought were overcome surfaced at unexpected moments. There were days when I woke up with a profound sadness, a crushing sense of failure. I remembered the looks of the affected families, the truncated careers, the lives scattered like pieces of a puzzle I would never fully assemble. Guilt echoed in the corners of my mind and heart, and sometimes the nights became endless, marked by the battle between remorse and the need to move forward. At those times, I returned to writing, a silent companion that allowed me to explore my interior without fear. Words were like a thread that helped me unravel the tangle of emotions trapped in my chest. I wasn't seeking immediate comfort, but truth, a deeper understanding of what I had lived through and what I could build from there. The pages began to fill with reflections, questions, sometimes pain, and other times renewed hope. In that intimacy with the paper arose a question that tormented and propelled me at the same time. Could this last sentence really be the starting point for something greater? A space where justice and humanity meet, where error is not an end but learning. Reflecting, I understood that the true judgment was not in the sentence itself, but in how I chose to face its consequences, how I was willing to transform and heal. These answers, though slowly, came in subtle and everyday forms. The music I listened to in the park, the warmth of an unexpected smile, the hug of a friend who understands without judgment, were the counterpoints to my moments of darkness. Little by little, the wall that had protected and enclosed me for years began to crumble. I discovered I was never really alone. What had happened was that I had isolated myself out of fear of pain, fear of facing judgment, not only from others, but my own. The memory of luminous moments in the courtroom, when justice felt like an act of real empathy and transformation, was the beacon that guided me in this reconstruction. They were not many, perhaps 1 or 2 a year, but those moments born of authentic humanity and deep listening restored my faith in the system and, more importantly, in myself. In them, I found reasons to believe that beyond the sentence there was an opportunity for repair and reconciliation. Thus, I understood that that heavy sentence did not define my life nor my essence. Rather, it became a crack through which a new form of justice could begin to emerge, one measured not only by rules or punishments, but by understanding, vulnerability, and love. Learning to accept this weight, inhabiting the contradictions it entails, was what finally allowed me to emerge from the darkness that had trapped me for so long. However, the hardest and deepest lesson remains the awareness of the power held by those who issue sentences. That power can transform, but can also destroy, sometimes with consequences no one imagines at the moment a decision is signed. The price paid, the invisible judgment we face in countless nights of solitude and doubt, is the true challenge imposed on those of us who bear the responsibility of deciding over others' lives. And even though the echo of that sentence resonates in history, I now know there is another justice, one born in the silence of the soul and attainable only through reflection, humility, and compassion. That personal, profound, and honest justice is what truly defines who we are beyond any verdict or headline. It is what allows us to turn pain into seed and solitude into space to reconnect with ourselves and others. Closing this chapter of my life does not mean closing all wounds or having all the answers. It means accepting that the path is long, full of detours, falls, and lessons. I carry with me, however, the certainty that the humanity behind the robe is what brings us closer to a possible ideal, one where justice is never an excuse for indifference, but a bridge that connects law with love, duty with empathy, sentence with forgiveness. I do not know if I will ever step into a courtroom again or if I will find a different purpose. Perhaps my legacy will not be a flawless ruling, but the testimony of someone who decided to face her shadows to build light. Because I have learned that the true sentence is not in the codes or at the bench, but in how we embrace the impact of our decisions, how we transform injustice into possibility and fear into real encounters. If there is one last lesson I can leave, it is this. Issuing a sentence, no matter how heavy, is not the end. It is the beginning of a much deeper judgment, one waged in the soul, confronting us with truth and the capacity to redeem ourselves. And in that silent battle, beyond the robe and the verdict, I have finally found the peace I was seeking, the justice I always wanted to serve. Over time, that connection with Eli became an anchor in a stormy sea. His struggle reminded me that justice is neither an abstract entity nor a chain of impersonal acts, but a living fabric made up of faces, stories, and hopes. As we met, sharing silences and words, a deep unease grew within me. How could the judicial system be so harsh without making room for the humanity Eli embodied? I wanted to understand it not from the distance of the bench, but from the closeness of someone who had seen the harm a sentence can inflict beyond the written words. One morning, while reviewing papers in a modest cafe, I received an unexpected message. It was Eli, with a question that seemed small but echoed in my chest. What comes after a sentence that hurts everyone? I answered honestly, without cliches or manual advice, with hard work and the will not to let the past govern the present. In that response, I felt a renewed commitment, something beyond formal justice, something that pushed me to be part of the change that, for years, I had only witnessed from the side of judgment and ruling. But the pressure and the memory of the media case continued to haunt me. Not a day passed without a new version, a new criticism, a new shadow affecting the confidence I once had. The possibility that this mistake would define the rest of my professional life loomed like a storm ready to sweep everything away. Yet, at that moment, perhaps for the first time, I was able to look at the sentence with a perspective that did not deny the pain but embraced it as part of a greater process. I realized that carrying that guilt could also be a driving force to push for reforms, to humanize the system from within, rather than judging only from the outside. In the judicial forum of that vulnerable encounter, I found a collective voice that seemed to tell me I was not alone, that justice has cracks, but also windows toward renewal. That hope became tangible when I was invited to join a working group focused on implementing emotional support mechanisms for judges and magistrates. It was, paradoxically, an acknowledgement of the invisible cost often borne by those of us who deliver verdicts with the weight of the world on our shoulders. Diana, a young psychologist coordinating the program, became an ally and confidant on that journey of reconstruction. At first, I almost doubted myself, questioning whether I had the energy to participate in something new, to reopen wounds I thought were closed. But the truth was that behind the facade, other needs demanded to come to light, the need to find meaning in what had happened, to share fear and guilt without being judged, to find paths toward collective healing. It was the same feeling I experienced in my meetings with Eli, where conversations became a mosaic of vulnerability and strength, pain and hope. In one of those difficult sessions, I remember sharing how the last sentence not only fractured those directly involved, but also made me question everything: my vocation, the system I represented, the very idea of justice. The room fell silent, and in that instant, I understood that this confession not only freed my tormented soul, but also planted seeds of transformation in other judicial strongholds. Humanization, I thought, is not a concession but a necessity that repairs, heals, and makes true justice possible. And then something unexpected happened. During an ordinary meeting of the Judicial Council, a proposal arose to modify trial protocols, focusing on the emotional and ethical care of those who issue sentences, but also on a rigorous review of the social and personal impacts of each serious ruling. The look they gave me at that moment was different, not that of a relentless judge, but someone who had gone a step further and become a bridge, a representative voice for those often made invisible. I truly felt the possibility of a new era in justice, an era where empathy and constant reflection are the pillars of every decision. But I never ceased to be surprised by how the past insisted on appearing at the least expected moments. One morning, just as I was preparing for a talk with law students at a local university, a series of articles appeared in the press reopening the media case, this time with new revelations and testimonies that further complicated public perception. The headlines were harsh, and although I hoped not to be affected, honestly, I felt the blow. It was as if that sentence, far from being left behind, dragged me back into the anguish and loneliness of that time. However, this time I was not alone, nor was I the same woman who years ago shut herself away in silence. I made a conscious decision to face the storm with honesty, to attend an interview where I could convey not only the facts, but my reasons, my doubts, my lessons. It was not easy to open my heart before an expectant audience, but the response was more humane and understanding than I had imagined. The questions were not only about what had failed, but also about how I proposed to improve a system that, one student said, needs less punishment and more bridges. Back home that night, I was overwhelmed by a contradictory feeling, exposed fragility and renewed strength. I understood that, despite everything, the path I had begun by opening up in that forum and with Eli, by accepting the shadow of my sentence, had allowed me to find something vital, the capacity to move forward, not to evade the past, but to use it as a beacon in the dark. I also understood that justice is not just a role or a function, but a permanent commitment to truth, reality, and the humanity in every story. Then, amidst that uncertain calm, I received a letter that arrived without warning, signed by one of those directly affected by that sentence. It was not a letter of reproach or resentment, but an invitation to meet, to talk without judgment, to explore ways to heal wounds and repair damage as best as possible. I remember reading those paragraphs over and over, feeling a door open, a possibility I had never fully considered, direct dialogue, human reconciliation outside formalities and media noise. I accepted the invitation with my heart pounding, with fear too, but with the urgency to go beyond paper and official words. The day we met was one of the most revealing moments of my life. We were not judge and condemned, nor victim and executioner. We were two wounded people seeking to rebuild something broken forever. There were tears, difficult words, and meaningful silences. I felt, more than ever, that true justice lies in that exact moment when pain looks you in the eye and you choose the path of encounter over division. When I left that meeting, the sun was setting, and the orange hues of the dusk softly illuminated the urban landscape of Atlanta. At that precise moment, I realized that the justice I had sought all my life was as complex and fragile as the human soul itself. That the weight of a sentence does not reside only in its wording, but in the capacity of those who issue it to face its consequences with honesty, courage, and love. Since then, I have decided that my last sentence will not be my last word or my final mark in the judicial world. It will rather be the point where a new path begins, one where justice and humanity intertwine their destinies instead of separating them. Because in that intersection, I have found not only the peace I sought, but the strength to keep dreaming of a system where failure is not synonymous with defeat, but with possibility. And perhaps that is the greatest truth I carry with me. The heaviest sentence is not the one read aloud in a courtroom, but the one we carry inside. The one that demands we look at ourselves with courage, without fear, and accept that we are complex, imperfect, human. That is the final judgment that matters, the one that defines not only the fate of those we judge, but our own. In that intimate battle, I have learned that, in the end, the deepest justice is the one born of love and understanding, and it is there where true freedom ultimately resides.